Remember, you are being recorded, so no heckling of the Paradigm Award winner. It's really, for me, it's really hard to know where to begin in introducing Peter Teague. It's safe to say that this event, the Breakthrough Dialogue, would not exist were it not for Peter. Neither would the Breakthrough Institute or Ecomodernism. Peter wrote the introduction to the Death of Environmentalism. He invited me and Michael Schellenberger to the Environmental Grantmakers Association meeting in Hawaii. Peter, they made the mistake of letting Peter chair the program committee. And so he got us both on the panels, and then we're like, here's a great idea. Let's write this crazy essay and self-publish it and bring it to the meeting and put it out on all the tables. And along with the two of us, he's the only person, the only other person who had a hand in both the Death of Environmentalism and the Ecomodernist Manifesto. But Peter's impact on sort of climate and environmental politics goes far, far beyond the Breakthrough Institute. I think it's fair to say it's been protean. He was the first funder of the Apollo project. He was the first green jobs funder. He was the first person in environmental philanthropy to recognize that energy poverty was a problem and to try to do something about it. We all now know not to tell people not to think of an elephant, because Peter thought to tell everybody in philanthropy about George Lakoff. And without quite knowing what he was getting into, Peter also became the first person in environmental philanthropy to actually fund and support nuclear advocacy as an environmental solution. And I think the reason that Peter is a great thinker is that he's first and foremost always been a great listener. He asks questions that nobody else asks. I think arguably his greatest talent is as an interlocutor and a conversationalist. He has a kind of, I think, a talent for drawing insights out of people that they didn't necessarily know that they actually had. And that's most especially been the case for me. For over 20 years, Peter has been an advisor, a sounding board, a champion, a taskmaster, and in some ways probably last and least a funder. And I think really, I really sort of figured out a lot of what I know and what I think and what sort of Breakthrough Institute and the Breakthrough's work would be and what ecomodernism would be by first trying to explain it to Peter. And the thing about Peter is that even when he's asking all the questions, a conversation with Peter is really not so much about explaining yourself as collaborating with him. It's not exactly Socratic, because in a Socratic dialogue, the questioner already knows the answer. And Peter, quite honestly and forthrightly doesn't. But the thing about Peter also is that he might not know the answer, but he knows it when he sees it. And a kind of like a long conversation with Peter, it's like part Socratic dialogue, and it's part cognitive therapy, and it's part design charrette. And what comes out of that is something that you've both actually created together. And I think that's the thing that's sort of most, in the over 20 years I've known Peter and worked with him in a variety of capacities, that's the thing that I think is sort of most essentially Peter. I think it's sort of kind of ironically or counterintuitively, it's sort of hardest to find the words to talk about the people who you should have the most to say about. So I'm going to stop here and just end with this. I think for over 20 years, sort of Peter's been like the third unindicted co-conspirator in the Death of Environmentalism and Breakthrough and the Ecomodernist project. And I'm very, very pleased that that ends tonight. So it is, with great pleasure and a great honor to present the last Breakthrough Paradigm Award at the last Breakthrough Dialogue to Peter Teague. And I'd like to also welcome up to the stage David Callahan, the founder and executive editor, publisher, I'll give you lots of titles, of Inside Philanthropy, to talk to Peter. And I'm really, really excited for this conversation. So please come up.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Your award looks a little like a lava lamp. It's very cool. So good to be up here with you.
Likewise.
So I have known that you're a big, important player in the philanthropy world for a long time, but I didn't know that you had earlier had a career in the political world, and you'd gotten a law degree, and then you'd gone and you'd worked in politics for some pretty major figures: Dianne Feinstein, Barbara Boxer, Leon Panetta. Seemed like you're on the fast track, and yet you kind of left all that behind and have been in the world of philanthropy ever since. So I guess I'd like to start by asking, what is so attractive about the foundation world, and why did you enter this world and stick around for 20 years?
Well, it's really interesting, David, to have you ask that question, because I think you have had the same insight, and you've acted on it that I've had, which is philanthropy is so much more important than we kind of give it credit for. Or I don't think we take it as seriously as we should, because it's actually extraordinarily consequential. And I actually, before I started doing this work, I was in LGBTQ philanthropy and activism. So there's kind of a weird jump from that to the Nathan Cummings Foundation, and then everything Ted described.
Yeah. So, it seems like a pivotal moment in your career is when you go to the Nathan Cummings Foundation, which at that point was a kind of up-and-coming, relatively new foundation. It had only been around for 15 years. Not a huge foundation, but with a very forward-leaning leader in Charlie Halperin, and you're brought in and end up playing a very pivotal role in that foundation, particularly in the environmental stuff. So as you got into that work, looking at where the environmental movement was at that time, 2002 is when you started working there. These were dark days for the environmental world. George Bush was in office. Republicans had a trifecta in Washington. What did you think was needed to kind of get progress going again?
What I observed when I went to Washington the second time to work for Senator Boxer and work for her on the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee was that we came in with Clinton in '93. Democrats had a trifecta, and even with that, really unable to pass any major environmental legislation. In fact, it had been since the early '70s when the whole architecture of American environmental law gets set up. There's very little passed in the next 20 years, and I thought this seems to be a movement that in some ways has just run out of gas. It doesn't seem to be able to kind of push forward. It's kind of defending what it created in the early 70s. And that felt like we need something different here. I would say, too, that at that point, the environmental movement, for very good reasons I certainly understood, and I watched this when I worked for Panetta, had adopted kind of the whole zeitgeist of the Reagan years, and so everything became about market-based solutions. We were going to put commodify everything, put a price on everything, talk about ecosystem services, and sort of apply this whole sort of conservative ideology to the environment. And I understood the reasons for it, but it also felt like a dead end, frankly.
Right.
Yeah.
So what did you come up with? In 2004, you were the main catalyst, I guess, in starting the Apollo Alliance, or a key player in that, or with cows and Institute for America's Future. Tell me the story of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Ted, thank you for that introduction. That was just incredibly sweet. I feel like this job, and really one of the answers, maybe the main answer to your question about why philanthropy, is it's so incredible to have access to the most brilliant people in the world on a regular basis. Every day you go to work and you get to talk to just incredibly smart people.
Everybody will take your calls.
Everybody will take your calls, and people are, yes.
And your jokes are funnier.
Yes. And I felt like my one talent was recognizing talent. If somebody might come in with an idea that was not quite there yet, but if I just had a sense that this person had something really important to share and to contribute, and if I got deep enough into a conversation with them, I just had this feeling like I just want to do what I can do to give them their main chance. I don't want to do what I think a lot of funders do, which is sort of give them enough to sort of get by and then tell them to go and find the rest of the money. I wanted to take whatever resources I had and just go and do this thing. And that's just been, what an incredible privilege. And I look at people, here's Kate Gordon and Joel Rogers and Ted and Adam, and I mean, all these amazing people in this room and other rooms who I've been able to help kind of support. It's just, an incredible gift.
The Apollo Alliance was a embodiment of this set of ideas about how to build a more optimistic, hope-centered vision for the environmental movement. What was the idea behind it?
Yeah, so this is sort of early 2000s, and the people who were going to champion climate progress were in the wilderness. The Bush administration was in power. I felt, as soon as I heard this idea from a guy, Bracken Hendricks, Bracken deserves huge credit for having sort of invented this idea or come up with this idea, was exactly as you said, to be positive, to be future-oriented, to be utopian. For me, really deeply, it was about being American. It was about this idea that when Americans come together, they can do anything. That we have this can-do spirit, that we take initiative, that we are innovative. And I felt like we need to harness that. Let's really harness that set of ideas and also get government back in the game. It just seemed so clear to me that we could not possibly even contribute to a global clean energy transition, which is the most complicated thing humans have ever attempted, and think that by sending gentle signals to the market, that the market was somehow going to produce all the clean energy technology we ever made. It just struck me as absolutely patently absurd, and yet this was the conventional wisdom. And so when Bracken showed up in our office and said we should have a $300 billion investment in clean energy as a public good, yes, exactly. Let's do industrial policy. Let's forget the last 20 years of Reaganomics and this whole idea of the market über alles, and let's actually get government back in the game, because only government could take us to the scale and the speed that we needed. And
at that point, those ideas were not very popular at all. This is the apex of neoliberalism. And in many ways, ideas that took quite some time to even get a lot of traction on the left and in the Democratic Party.
Absolutely.
In recent years.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Nathan Cummings Foundation was the only funder of Apollo for several years before we had any partners in that. And
you catalyzed some other things, or was the first funder or the main funder of some other things during this period, the Blue-Green Alliance and Van Jones's work, Green for All. Tell us how you saw these different pieces fit together, because I know that a lot of people in philanthropy think of ecosystems and portfolios, and you're going to create a whole kind of world that, shifts paradigms and such. And so how were you thinking of all this? And what was remind people what the Blue-Green Alliance was?
Yeah, there had been a dream, I think going back, Joel could probably tell us, probably to the 60s or 70s, certainly, that if you could bring together the two largest organized constituencies on the left, that is labor and environment, that you would have a formidable political force. And this had been attempted multiple times over the years. It had never quite come together. It never worked. And so I think there was a dream that if we took this idea of large-scale investment in clean energy, that you could build that kind of alliance, that you finally had the substance around which you could bring those forces together. And as you said, initially, there wasn't a huge amount of buy-in. I remember the environmentalists were particularly concerned that when we took the plan to them, they said, well, it doesn't say climate anywhere in any of your materials. We said, exactly. And they just thought that was the stupidest thing they'd ever heard. Right. So it took a while to bring that alliance together, but it did come together, and it's still together.
Yeah. So around the same time, you're setting in motion these different initiatives that you're funding, and this is the time of Death of Environmentalism, and I don't know the backstory in terms of how did you get involved with Ted and Michael? What was your role? You wrote the foreword, but tell us how all that came about.
Yeah, I actually initially started working with Michael around LGBT work. It's a whole story, but it was very interesting. Michael said, look, you guys are just sort of doing triage, playing defense. You need to go after the homophobes. Ironic. But he suggested that we should pick a poster child. At the time, Dr. Laura Schlesinger had the largest radio audience in the country, and she was saying increasingly homophobic things. And so I took out full-page ads. I was running this little dinky community foundation here in San Francisco in the Bay Area. I took out full-page ads in the New York Times, the Washington Post, LA Times, and accusing her of hurting kids. And she immediately hit back, which was brilliant. And then we were on the news consistently for 30 days. Michael actually put me on Fox News. I was on Sean Hannity's show twice.
Sounds like fun.
I have the distinction that some grad student wrote a piece about this. That for some time, I had the distinction of being the person that Sean Hannity muted. He muted my mic more often than anybody else. It's pretty cool. So that's how I got to know Michael. And then when I got to New York and the Nathan Cummings Foundation, Michael came to me with all these ideas he was pitching. He wanted to take on and shame people about driving SUVs, for example. And I kept saying, no, 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 no. And then I heard about this Apollo, what became the Apollo idea. It was not called Apollo at that time. And I thought, what you need is a good communications person. And I know this guy in the Bay Area, Michael Schellenberger. He can help turbocharge this with communications. And then Michael knew Ted, and Ted, we need a pollster to kind of figure out what should the messaging be about. And Ted was the one who really invented green jobs as a messaging focal point. And we just sort of pieced the talent together. And I was saying this to Kate earlier. I think I probably committed the error of joining together a bunch of sort of shotgun marriages of people who ended up not liking each other very much. Brought in Van Jones, but for me it was like, wow, we need that guy and this person, and let's bring all this talent together. Kate and Joel, and amazing cast of characters, which eventually sort of flew apart at the seams because they didn't like each other very much.
So I gather that when the Death of Environmentalism came out, and it had at the EGA, I guess was where you presented, and you were on it as a person who had written the foreword, so your name was associated. I gather that the reception from your fellow environmental philanthropists was not overwhelmingly positive.
It was almost cartoonishly outraged. I was sort of rising in the Environmental Grantmakers Association, and I was the chair of the program committee, and which meant that you were going to go on the board and all of that kind of stuff. And I was immediately excommunicated. Almost immediately excommunicated from the organization. I remember going.
Actually kicked out?
So I went to post. They had a listserv, which reached several hundred environmental grant makers, which I had posted on regularly before. And when the New York Times picked up and put the Death of Environmentalism on the front page, I thought, well, we should obviously be talking about this. It's highly relevant to our field. So I put it on the EGA listserv, and it never went on the EGA listserv. I was told that I had been X'd. I was not allowed access anymore.
And what lesson did you learn about the world of philanthropy? The world of philanthropy at that point. I mean, I cover the world of philanthropy for a living, and I would say that one thing that I've learned, having been in it less long than you have, is that there is a fair amount of groupthink, and it is not a super duper intellectual world where mixing it up in a frank and robust way is particularly valued. Was that your experience?
And it's ironic because you would think that would be exactly what it should be about. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, you're given the responsibility of having all this money and having to make really important decisions,
yeah.
that you would want
and oh, by the way, you're accountable to nobody.
Exactly.
Yeah, so you could do whatever the hell you want, and there's no repercussions in theory.
Exactly. And you would think, sort of robust debate would be at the very center of the project. And as you know better than I do, it's absolutely not.
Yeah.
In most philanthropic rooms, everybody is super polite to each other. Nobody disagrees. It's when they leave the room that the knives come out. But yeah, it absolutely does not accept debate.
Why do you think that is?
Gosh, such a good question. Probably has something to do with the fact that you have a bunch of completely unaccountable people. I don't know. You may have a better.
It may have something to do with the lack of ideological diversity. We did a survey of Inside Philanthropy readers, and we asked them to rate themselves politically from 1 to 10, 10 being the most liberal. The mean score was 8. So, maybe those are just the readers of Inside Philanthropy, which does have a kind of more progressive tilt. But
it's certainly been my experience in 30 years.
Yeah.
Every room I'm in ultimately is Team Blue.
Yeah. Okay, so back to the trajectory here. So you're promoting these ideas. You've helped fund and catalyze the Apollo Alliance, the Blue-Green Alliance, Van Jones and Green for All. Green jobs has become part of the kind of conversation. The Obama administration is interested in this. Van Jones becomes the green jobs czar, which does not go well.
Yeah.
And Waxman Markey, goes down in flames. But the green, you obviously were getting some traction there because of the Van Jones appointment. And Waxman Markey, while it's mainly remembered for its cap and trade provisions, it had money for green jobs and clean energy innovation. How did you see that whole period, and what were your main takeaways, and how did the rest of the philanthropic sector see what had happened there? Because many of them had invested heavily in trying to make this a big forward moment. What was your takeaway from that period?
Yeah, first thing was that I saw Apollo as an ideological challenge to the dominant neoliberal view. And to me, that was critical. That was like, had we won that argument at that point, I felt like that was the thing that was most important to me. And I felt like suddenly I realized that my team doesn't get the point, that my team is suddenly running back in the direction of a market-based solution and all the blah, blah, blah. And a solution that, and Breakthrough, Ted and Michael and others, and Alex and others at Breakthrough were narrating this on an almost daily basis throughout that period, explaining exactly why cap and trade would not work. Roger Pilkey in the room, sort of coined his iron law, where no political economy in the world is ever going to impose a carbon tax high enough to do what needs to be done in terms of solving for climate change. It was just a political impossibility. They turned out to be exactly correct about their analysis, and yet philanthropy, in terms of its groupthink and its lockdown on this is what we're going to do. So we got, the Apollo Alliance and that set of ideas, I think, deeply shaped the Obama stimulus package, $90 billion in clean energy funding, which turned out to be extremely consequential in terms of the amount of technology, the performance improvements, cost reductions in wind and solar battery technology. We would not have EVs at the state they are now had it not been for that. So it was really, really important. It worked. I think we demonstrated this actually worked, and I think that we began to affect that ideological shift that would, I think, have been great had it happened earlier than it has turned out to happen. So I felt like philanthropy didn't understand what the project was about from my perspective.
Were there other major philanthropic funders eventually behind the Apollo Alliance?
There were a few other funders finally towards the end, but then all of that funding then shifted to pursuing cap and trade. And so Apollo just died of starvation at the end. There was like no money left for it. And so I just felt like it was really a shame that we took that path, because I think had we stayed on the Apollo path, what we had was a political winner. And cap and trade turned out to be one of two ginormous political albatrosses going into the 2010 elections. Yeah. The Democrats lost a net 68 seats, not entirely because of cap and trade, but cap and trade contributed to that loss. So you had this really historically epic disaster for which philanthropy was in large part the architect, and there was absolutely no accountability.
Well, not to go too far down a what-if pathway, but could you imagine a very different kind of climate bill that Obama put forward that would have centered the ideas of the Apollo Alliance? Or was that just that cake so far away from rising that just wasn't going to happen at that period? Or
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to know. I mean, if we look back at that period, I think there was a lot of talk about the fact that the stimulus was maybe half as big as it needed to be. The White House, I think, decided that it was simply not possible to go back for more money. So, maybe there was no possibility of continuing the Apollo politics. But I can't help but think, even if we had not gotten more money, I think that the political, I think Democrats and people who care about climate change would have been a lot better off pursuing that path.
Right. So all those efforts crash and burn in 2009, 2010. Tea Party comes in. At this point, the climate issue is becoming highly polarized. So anything that the Democrats are for, Republicans are against. So then sort of fast forward the story here up to the present day with the Biden administration and the historic achievements in the climate area. And it seems like your ideas have been really triumphant in a sense that the carrots are front and center. This has been an investment strategy. It's not just the money in the IRA, but also there's money in chips. There's money in the infrastructure bill for the kinds of investments that you've been advocating for 20 years. Do you feel like this is a moment of vindication? I mean,
I mean, I think Ted is a lot more realistic than I am in general. And, he'll sort of downplay this, and we were naive, and blah, blah, blah. I was like, God, we won. Let's just we did. I feel like we won. It's not everything we ever dreamed of. It's a lot more money than we ever dreamed of, actually, and spent a lot more intelligently than we thought about. So I think it's quite a remarkable accomplishment. There's lots of people who are sort of Monday morning quarterbacking. That's a sports analogy, which I don't really do. Let's see. There's a lot of people will say, it shouldn't have passed on reconciliation because that polarizes the issue. But that's just not the way politics works, right? You seize your opportunities as they present themselves. The fact that they got it done is just a miracle. The groups that worked on that and really just were unbelievably persistent and sticking with it, I give them huge credit for that. And I want to double back and say, Bracken Hendricks, the guy who started all this, and for me in 2003, he shows up as one of the chief architects of Jay Inslee's climate plan, which forms the basis of a lot of what ends up coming. I think seizing the opportunity of that moment when large-scale public investment is possible for a minute in shaping what became that set of investment packages. So I think that I think Apollo actually, the whole arc of it is 20 years. But we got it done.
Yeah, and these new investments also happened against this larger shift in this turn against the neoliberal consensus of the Reagan and post-Reagan era, and that made possible a different kind of thinking. I mean, if you want to spread around credit, I would give some to places like the Roosevelt Institute that was very important in kind of challenging the neoliberal consensus, and so it feels like a different era.
It does. I worry a little bit that as I've talked to groups working on these issues now, I think groups have by and large resigned themselves to the idea that that was an amazing moment, it's now past, there will be no more investments for certainly the remainder of the decade. Regardless of what happens in November, we're going to hunker down, we're going to kind of make do with what we've got. And that's entirely realistic and maybe the only thing that's possible. I am so excited to talk to people who are thinking big about what this era of crisis may unlock in terms of opportunities that we're not really, I just worry that we're not going to be ready, if things open up again.
Right. Well, part of your theory from the beginning with the Apollo Alliance and other initiatives was that this would create a virtuous political cycle, that people would see the benefits of making these investments in clean energy, and that jobs would be created and people's lives would be changed and political constituencies would merge and the polarization would break down. And how hopeful are you about that kind of politics emerging, as these many hundreds of billions of dollars get spent in local communities, and what's the prognosis there?
Yeah, I think my naivete has been that there would be much more immediate political benefit to all of this, and I think that's just not the case. I continue to believe that over time. I think you said this. There's about 14% of the money has gone out the door so far. We haven't really, most communities have not seen the benefits. I continue to think this is going to shift the political dynamics in a positive way over time and create momentum for more investment and more progress over time. So I mean, big picture, long term, I think we might do really well.
So last question, coming back to philanthropy. So we are in this really exciting moment in philanthropy. A lot of new money is showing up at the table. Many billionaire mega donors have appeared just in the last 5 years. I mean, you have Steve and Connie Ballmer, the latest gazillionaires to show up on the scene. Jeff Bezos is now the single biggest climate funder around. You have Lorraine Powell Jobs with her climate environmental foundation. You advise philanthropists, if one of these new, mega billionaire climate donors showed up at your digital doorstep and was like, Peter, tell me what to do. I want to give billions to this subject. What would you tell them?
I guess a couple of things. One of the things I've learned from Ted and others is the critical importance of understanding where you are and what the world actually looks like. Put aside sort of the fantasies and the imaginary ways in which an energy transition might happen or that greater equity might arrive. Like, deal with reality. So the first thing is let's get a really clear view of what's going on. And then the second thing is really a lesson I think that Rachel Pritzker teaches us in her philanthropy, which is, so many, I have had these conversations with the new billionaire class. And the one thing, they want two things. They all want to find white space, the empty space where nobody else is. And then they want the vindication of bringing somebody else into the white space with them. They all want some friend of theirs, who's also a billionaire, to come in with them. So it's kind of a weird thing. Just have the courage of your convictions and go and do the thing. Don't be waiting around for somebody. Rachel has done some of the most extraordinary philanthropy I've ever seen, really. I mean, I can't tell you, in the last 3 weeks, I have been in rooms like this that would not exist were it not for Rachel's philanthropy. She is bringing people together across divides. It's absolutely amazing. And I don't see Rachel waiting for anybody else to vindicate her choices. She's just she's got clarity, and she goes and she does amazing things. So that would be maybe my main advice for any.
Be like Rachel.
Be like Rachel.
Well, Peter, congratulations. Congratulations for your Paradigm Award and all your impressive accomplishments. And
thank you, David.
very
Thanks
good
for
to be-
doing this.
Yes.